Working as a night nurse always seemed like a challenge to me, but I had never thought that my life could change so drastically in a single night. The hospital where I worked was old, a place with worn-out walls and long hallways where silence could become an enemy. I had seen my share of tragedies, of faces slowly fading and of relatives torn apart by pain. But what happened that night was different. It was something I will never forget. We had received the admission of an elderly woman in critical condition. No one was with her. No one looked for her or asked about her. We only knew one name, Margaret. Her condition was delicate. Her body was weak from age, and her breathing seemed to cling to life with the last strength of her lungs. When I was assigned to take care of her, something in her gaze made me uncomfortable. It was not the expression of resignation that I usually saw in patients in her situation. It was something deeper, something almost disturbing, as if she knew something that I didn't. I spent a large part of the night monitoring her. Despite her weakness, her eyes kept following me. Every time I entered the room, there were moments when she seemed like she was going to speak, but her lips barely moved. I didn't dare ask her anything. I just did my duty, checking her vital signs and adjusting her medications. However, that feeling of being watched never left me. Around 3 in the morning, I found her awake, with her gaze fixed on the ceiling. Her breathing was heavy, and the monitor next to her showed worrying signs. I approached her bed to adjust the pillow and the oxygen mask. Then, with a force I didn't expect, she took my hand. Her skin was cold, and the contact made me shudder. "Thank you for taking care of me," she said in a barely audible whisper. Her voice was so soft that I had to lean in to hear her better. And then, she added something that took my breath away. "Now it's your turn." Before I could ask what she meant, her body relaxed, and the monitor beeped continuously. Margaret had died. The rest of the night was chaos. I notified the doctor on duty and completed the necessary paperwork to transfer her body. But her words kept echoing in my head. "Now, it's your turn." I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps they were delusions, the ravings of a mind that was nearing the end. But there was something in her tone, something in the firmness of her grip, that I couldn't ignore. When I finished my shift and got home, I was exhausted. I flopped down on the bed in my scrubs, too tired to change. But I found no rest that night. I dreamed of Margaret. In the dream, she was standing at the foot of my bed, dressed in the same hospital gown she had been wearing when she died. Her face was paler than it should have been, and her eyes shone with an unnatural gleam. But the worst thing was her smile. It wasn't a warm or kind smile. It was a crooked grimace, an expression that radiated something dark, something evil. "It's your turn," she said in the dream, in a voice that didn't sound entirely human. I woke up suddenly, gasping. I looked around my room, expecting to find her there, but it was empty. Yet, the feeling of her presence still hung in the air, as if she had left something behind. The next few days were torment. I tried to get on with my normal life, but the experience had left its mark on me. Every time I was alone, I felt like someone was watching me. In the hospital, the hallways seemed darker, and the shadows deeper. Even in rooms filled with light, I always felt Margaret's presence, as if she were waiting. I began to have recurring nightmares. In them, I was always in the room where Margaret had died. The bed was empty, but the monitor kept emitting the continuous beeping that marked the end. Then, I would see her standing in the corner of the room, with that same crooked smile. She would try to talk to me, but her words were a senseless murmur, a litany that filled me with an inexplicable terror. One night, while checking on a patient in critical condition, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a physical sensation, as if someone was standing behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one. However, in the reflection of the monitor, I saw something that made me freeze. The figure of Margaret was there, behind me, looking at me with that macabre smile. After that night, things only got worse. Objects in my house began to move. The lights flickered constantly and sometimes went out completely, leaving me in the dark with the feeling that I was not alone. One night, I woke up with marks on my arm, as if someone had held me while I slept. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was following me, something that had started with Margaret. I decided to investigate. I checked the hospital files, looking for more information about her. What I found left me frozen. Margaret had been admitted several times before, always with serious illnesses. But the strange thing was that, on each occasion, the staff that had cared for her reported experiences similar to mine, nightmares, sensations of being watched, and, in some cases, unexplained accidents that led to their deaths. She was not the first nurse that Margaret had marked. Shortly after, I decided to leave the hospital. I could not bear the weight of her presence any longer. But even after I walked away, Margaret followed me. To my new job, in a completely different place, I kept seeing her. In the reflections, in the shadows, in the corners where the light didn't reach. With that crooked smile. Now, I know there is no escape. Her words were a warning. A notice that my fate was sealed. And as I write this, I can feel her presence behind me, waiting for the moment when I can no longer ignore it. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe the channel for future videos, and like and share with your friends. I worked as a night nurse in the intensive care unit of St. Caroline Hospital. The building, built decades ago, had an oppressive atmosphere, as if the walls themselves absorbed the suffering and the last sighs of those who spent their final days there. The intensive care unit was the heart of that anguish, a place where life hung by a thread and where death was a constant visitor. But no one spoke openly of what I was about to witness. There was a rumor that circulated among the more lucid patients, a whisper that sometimes reached the ears of the staff. They said that just before dying, some patients saw a blue flame flickering over their beds. It was not an ordinary light. It was not a reflection or a flash from the monitors. It was something else, something they could not explain. "It's the warning," they said. "When you see it, you know there is no turning back." I did not give it importance. In a place where death was almost routine, minds can play tricks. I thought it was delusions or hallucinations caused by pain, fear, or medication. But that was before I saw it myself. It was a quiet night, or as quiet as it can be in an intensive care unit. The monitors beeped constantly, and the hum of the fluorescent lights filled the air with a monotonous sound that one learned to ignore. I was checking the patient's vital signs when I reached Mrs. Langley's bed, an older woman who had been admitted a few days ago with severe respiratory failure. Her condition was critical but stable. Although she didn't talk much, she always looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and resignation. As I adjusted her oxygen mask, I noticed her eyes were fixed on something above her head. "Is everything okay?" I asked her, but she didn't answer. Her lips moved, but the words were barely a murmur. I followed her gaze, and then I saw it. A blue light floating just above her bed. At first, I thought it was a fault in the equipment or a reflection. But it wasn't that. The flame was small, the size of a candle, and it flickered with a hypnotic intensity. Its color was deep, a blue that didn't seem to belong to this world. It floated in the air, moving slightly, as if it were alive. I froze, unable to look away. Time seemed to stop. I could hear the sound of my own slow, heavy breathing, mixing with the constant beeping of Mrs. Langley's heart monitor. But then the sound changed. The monitor beeped louder, a sign that her heart rate was rapidly dropping. "Mrs. Langley," I exclaimed, trying to revive her. But within seconds, the monitor beeped continuously, deafeningly. I looked at the flame, and just before it disappeared, I thought I saw something else inside it. A shadow, or maybe a tiny figure, that vanished with the light. Mrs. Langley was dead. I spent the rest of the night in a state of shock. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. What could I say? A blue flame appeared over a patient before she died? No one would believe me, or worse yet, they would think I was losing my mind. But the memory of the light would not leave me alone. I would close my eyes, and I could see it flickering with that impossible blue. In the following days, I began to notice things that I had previously ignored. Comments from patients, fragments of conversations that spoke of a light or a signal. Even some of the staff were talking in low voices about something they didn't want to name directly. A nurse, Mrs. Grayson, once mentioned that the monitors would sometimes flicker for no reason, just before a patient died. "It's like something is going on around here," she said, laughing nervously. But now, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. A week later, I had another encounter with the blue flame. It was around 3 in the morning, and I was checking the monitors when I heard a strange sound. It wasn't the usual beeping of the machines. It was rather a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to come from the air itself. I turned to Mr. Ailes' bed, a middle-aged man who had been admitted for a severe heart attack. He was awake, with his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. "Mr. Ailes?" I asked, approaching his bed. But he didn't answer. His lips were trembling, and his hands were gripping the sheets so tightly his knuckles were white. I followed the direction of his gaze, and there it was again, the blue flame. This time, it wasn't floating motionless. It slowly moved back and forth, as if it were examining Mr. Ailes. The air around him was colder, and a feeling of pressure filled the room, as if something invisible was descending. I tried to move, to do something, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was watch as the flame came closer and closer to Mr. Ailes. When the flame finally touched his body, he let out a long, deep sigh, and his monitor went off. He died silently, as if the flame had taken everything that was left of him. After that night, I began to dread my night shifts. Every time I entered the intensive care unit, I felt like something was waiting for me. I walked the halls, feeling like the flame could appear at any moment over any bed. I began to avoid looking at the patients directly, fearing that I would meet their gazes fixed on something that I could see too. I finally decided to speak to the head nurse. I hoped she would listen to me, assure me that it was all a figment of my imagination. But when I mentioned the blue flame, her face hardened. "This is not something we should talk about," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Some things can't be explained, and we shouldn't try to." Her answer left me more uneasy than before. If she also knew about the flame, why didn't anyone do anything? What was that light? And why could I see it? The last time I saw the flame, it was the worst of all. I was checking on a little boy who had been admitted for severe pneumonia. He was only 5 years old, and despite his difficulty breathing, he always smiled when I entered the room. I quickly became fond of him and did everything I could to make him feel comfortable. That night, while I watched him, I felt the same low hum that I had heard before. My heart began to pound, and when I looked up, I saw it. The blue flame hovering over his bed, flickering softly. I wanted to scream, to do something, but I was paralyzed. The boy saw it too. I know because his smile disappeared, and his eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to go," he whispered, his voice breaking. The flame slowly approached, and before I could do anything, it touched his small body. Everything was silent. His monitor turned off and he stopped breathing. After that, I quit. I couldn't keep working in a place where death had such a tangible presence, so real. But even now, years later, I can't forget the blue flame. In the darkest nights, when the silence becomes deafening, sometimes I think I see a blue flicker in the shadows. And I know that one day, it will come for me too. Ever since I started working at the hospital, I had always felt a strange atmosphere in the intensive care room. Something in the air seemed to oppress, as if the very environment was charged with a disturbing energy. I had heard rumors among the staff about apparitions and unexplained events, but I had always taken them as mere stories to scare the newbies. However, it was impossible to ignore the repeated testimonies of patients who, with their last strength, whispered about a shadow that approached their beds during the night. I decided that I needed to check it out for myself. I couldn't stand the idea that something so sinister was stalking my patients and doing nothing about it. I prepared myself for a long night of vigil, armed only with my flashlight and a firm resolution. The first night passed without incident, except for the disturbing silence interrupted by the constant hum of the life support machines. The second night, however, was different. The feeling of being watched was almost palpable. Despite the tiredness, I stayed alert, walking through the narrow and cold hallways, checking each of the patients over and over again. The clock moved forward with a torturous slowness, marking each minute with a tick-tock that resonated in the stillness of the early morning. It was around 3 in the morning when I saw it. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me due to lack of sleep. But then, I clearly distinguished it. A dark shadow, blacker than the night itself, sliding across the floor toward the bed of one of the patients. I froze, unable to move or look away. The shadow seemed to absorb the light around it, creating an impenetrable darkness. It slowly rose, taking a vaguely humanoid form, although without discernible features. My heart beat wildly in my chest as I watched the figure lean over the patient, who was lying unconscious. I tried to scream and run toward them, but my legs did not respond. An invisible force seemed to hold me in place, as if the shadow had extended its influence to me. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the figure vanished into the air, leaving me shaking and sweating cold. The patient did not survive the night. Although his condition was already critical, I couldn't help but feel that he had been condemned from the moment the shadow had manifested itself next to his bed. Full of determination, I knew that I had to continue with my vigils. I couldn't allow that entity to continue claiming lives without facing some resistance. The following nights were a constant torment. Each shadow in the darkness seemed to come to life, and each creak of the building startled me like an unwanted guest. The few hours of sleep I got were plagued with nightmares. However, I continued forward, feeling that I had a mission to fulfill. On one of those nights, as I walked the halls with the flashlight in hand, I heard a whisper coming from the farthest room, where the patient was connected to multiple life support machines. The sound was barely audible but unmistakably human. I moved forward cautiously, sweat running down my forehead. When I opened the door, I saw it again. The shadow was standing next to the bed, leaning over the patient. This time, a kind of black mist seemed to emanate from its form, enveloping the patient. My instinct screamed at me to run, to leave that place, but something deeper, a sense of duty, or perhaps simple desperation, forced me to move forward. I took a step forward, and the shadow turned toward me. It had no face, but I felt its gaze piercing me. A wave of terror enveloped me, leaving me breathless. I tried to lift the flashlight to shine some light on the thing, but my hands were shaking too much. The shadow extended a kind of arm, and a deadly cold took hold of me. I stepped back clumsily, falling to the ground. The shadow approached slowly and inexorably. My strength abandoned me, and for a moment, I thought that this would be my last night. However, at the last instant, something seemed to catch the entity's attention, and it vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. Several minutes passed before I could move. I dragged myself out of the room, breathing with difficulty. The patient, like the previous ones, did not survive until dawn. My mind was in chaos, and the certainty that that thing would return filled me with overwhelming hopelessness. I decided to look for answers. There was something in that shadow that could not be ignored. I reviewed the hospital files, looking for any clue that could explain its presence. Reports from other nurses and doctors who had noticed strange things, but never with such clarity as I had experienced. Some old records spoke of a patient who had died in mysterious circumstances many years ago. It was said that he had been an evil man, responsible for unimaginable atrocities, and that his spirit had never found rest. There were rumors that his soul had been trapped in the hospital, feeding on the fear and suffering of the sick. Each night, the shadow seemed to grow stronger. His presence became more oppressive and terrifying. The patients who reported having seen it followed the same fatal destiny, and I felt more and more helpless. There was no way to protect them from something so intangible and malevolent. My superiors began to notice my wear and tear. They questioned me about my vigils, but could not comprehend the true terror I faced. Their responses were skeptical and condescending, suggesting I needed rest and possibly psychological help. But I knew they couldn't help me, not with this. On one of the last nights, I decided to arm myself with more than just a flashlight. I brought a video camera, hoping to capture some tangible evidence of the shadow. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I positioned the camera at a strategic angle and sat waiting, my heart pounding in my ears. The hours passed with maddening slowness. Finally, the shadow appeared. It slid across the floor with its dark elegance, approaching the bed of a patient who was barely clinging to life. I watched through the lens of the camera, my hand visibly shaking. The recording showed nothing but deep darkness, a void that seemed to devour the light. The shadow rose, and for the first time, it seemed to notice the camera. A chill ran down my spine as it turned to me, ignoring the patient. The lens fogged up with a black mist, and the camera abruptly stopped working. It was as if the shadow had directly intervened in the technology, silencing any attempt to document it. Desperation and panic invaded me. I knew I couldn't continue like this. The constant stalking of the shadow, the inevitability of its attacks, were destroying my mental health. But still, I felt that I couldn't abandon my patients to their fate. I needed to find a solution, some way to stop that entity. I sought help outside the hospital, going to experts in the paranormal. But their answers were vague and unencouraging. Some suggested protection rituals, others spoke of the need for complex exorcisms. But nothing they said gave me the certainty of being able to face the shadow successfully. The last night, I decided to stand guard. The atmosphere was charged with an unbearable tension. Every fiber of my being knew that something definitive was about to happen. I prepared myself with the little I had, my flashlight and a cross that one of the experts had given me. I stood in the central room, where the monitors emitted their incessant buzzing. It was close to 3 in the morning when the temperature in the room dropped drastically. The shadow appeared again, this time more defined, more tangible. Its darkness was almost solid, a physical presence that seemed to suck the air around it. I felt the same paralyzing terror of the previous nights, but I forced myself to stand firm. The shadow slid toward me, ignoring the patients for the first time. I felt its intention, a pure and overflowing malevolence that sought to consume my will. I raised the cross, hoping it could offer me some protection. The shadow stopped for an instant, then advanced again, as if my gesture had been a mere inconvenience. My breathing became erratic as the shadow loomed over me. The cold was unbearable, and panic weakened me. In that moment, I understood that there was no way to defeat it. Not with the cross, not with the flashlight. It was a force beyond human understanding, something that had existed in that hospital long before me. Finally, the shadow enveloped me. I felt an overwhelming void, an absolute darkness that seemed to devour my soul. I lost track of time and space, plunged into an endless blackness. My body collapsed, but my mind was trapped in that hellish experience. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on the floor of the intensive care unit. The shadow had disappeared, but its presence still echoed in every corner of the place. The patients were still in their beds, unaware of the horror that had just happened. I got up with difficulty, feeling an insurmountable weight on my heart. The hospital continued its routine, ignorant of the evil that lurked within its walls. No one believed my stories, and soon I was forced to abandon my post. But the shadow was still there, waiting for its next opportunity. Having seen the indescribable, I knew there was no escape. The experience left a mark on me, and every night, I relived those moments in my dreams. The terror of the shadow became a constant in my life, a reminder that there are things in this world that escape our understanding and that can lurk in the most unexpected places. I found no peace, no liberation, only a deep feeling of unease that will always accompany me. The shadow remains in the hospital, waiting for its next victim, while I continue forward with the weight of its memory, knowing that I will never be able to forget the horror that I witnessed. Working in a rural hospital in 1950 was not something glamorous. The emergency room of St. Horry Hospital was small, poorly lit, and always had a strangely oppressive atmosphere. There was a permanent smell of disinfectant that couldn't disguise the smell of humidity that permeated the walls. I had been working there for months, getting used to the disturbing silence of the nights and the slight echo of footsteps in the empty corridors. However, nothing prepared me for what I experienced one autumn night. I had heard the patients murmur about something strange in the emergency room, something that always happened in the same room, room 105. That room had a peculiarity. The only window that faced outside was blocked by a brick wall that had been built years ago when an extension of the hospital left that part isolated. But despite the window, I didn't give it much thought. Some patients claimed to have seen an old woman there, looking at them and smiling. At first, I thought they were delusions of sick people or stories that patients shared to distract themselves. I didn't give it too much importance. There are always rumors in hospitals, places where life and death constantly intersect. But little by little, the stories accumulated. Different patients, on different days, wrote the same thing. An older woman with long gray hair, a wrinkled but smiling face, watching them from the window of room 105. And they always said the same thing. She wasn't there to help me. She just looked at me. One quiet night, when the clock struck 2 in the morning, they assigned me to check on a patient in room 105. It was an older man who had come in with a high fever. While I was taking his vital signs, I noticed he was restless, with his eyes fixed on the window. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "Is everything okay?" I asked him, trying to sound reassuring. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, as if he was afraid that someone would hear it. "She always comes at this time." A shiver ran down my spine, but I tried to ignore it. I turned to the window, more by instinct than curiosity, and I saw nothing. Only the dark and inert brick wall, reflecting the dim light of the room. I breathed a sigh of relief, although I couldn't deny that the atmosphere felt heavier, as if the air was charged with something invisible. I finished attending to the patient and returned to my station. But that feeling of discomfort didn't disappear. The man's words kept echoing in my mind. "She always comes at this time." I tried to concentrate on my work, but I couldn't stop looking at the clock. 3 in the morning was slowly approaching, and my mind kept imagining what could be happening in that room. I finally decided to go back. I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing to worry about, that the rumors were just that, rumors. I walked down the empty hallway, feeling how the echo of my footsteps seemed louder than usual. The door of room 105 was slightly ajar, and the sound of a slight whisper reached my ears. I couldn't make out words, but it was a constant murmur, as if someone was speaking softly on the other side of the door. I pushed the door cautiously and entered. The room was completely silent, and the patient was sleeping soundly. Everything seemed normal, but something led me to look at the window, and then I saw her. She was exactly as she had been described. An old woman with long, messy gray hair, a wrinkled face, and a fixed smile. She was there, staring at me from the other side of the glass, as if the wall behind her didn't exist. Her sunken, dark eyes seemed to glow with a light of their own. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, as if she had been waiting. My body froze. I wanted to scream, to run, but it was as if my voice and my legs had stopped obeying me. The old woman's smile began to change, stretching beyond the natural, revealing crooked, dark teeth. Her hands, that until then I hadn't noticed, rose up and began to gently tap the glass, leaving wet marks that slowly slid down. I finally gathered the courage to look away and run out of the room. My heart was beating so fast, I thought I would pass out at any moment. I didn't stop until I reached the station, where I slumped into a chair, breathing heavily. No one else was around. The other nurses were busy on the opposite wing. I was alone with what I had seen. I tried to convince myself that it had been a hallucination, the product of my tired mind. But when I looked back down the hall leading to room 105, the door was completely closed. And from where I sat, I could swear I saw a flash of movement at the window, as if someone had walked behind it. The next morning, I told the head nurse what had happened. Mrs. Holden. I expected her to laugh, to tell me it was impossible. But instead, she looked at me with a serious expression. "You're not the first to see it," she said quietly. "That window has been a problem ever since the fire." "What fire?" I asked, trying to understand. "Years ago, before they built the wall, that room looked out onto the backyard. An old woman died in the fire. She was trapped on the 3rd floor, right in front of that window. They say she was left alone, that no one came back for her. When they found her body, she was in that window, banging on the glass, as if trying to get out. I felt my stomach sink. Everything fit too well. I tried not to think about it anymore, but the following nights were a torment. I avoided room 105 at all costs, and every time I passed by, I felt like something was watching me. Even in other areas of the hospital, I always had the feeling that there was someone behind me. A constant and inescapable presence. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I left work shortly after, looking for something that would take me away from that oppressive atmosphere. But even now, years later, I remember her in my nightmares. The old woman is still at the window, looking at me with that impossible smile, banging on the glass with hands that can never come off. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when I'm alone, I feel like something is behind me, waiting for me to dare to look. Working in the pediatric wing of St. Mary's Hospital in 1950 was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it was comforting to take care of the little ones, seeing them laugh and sometimes recover from illnesses that seemed impossible to overcome. But the nights, especially the long and silent ones, had a different air. The hallways were filled with shadows, and the usual sounds of the hospital seemed to take on a more disturbing quality. There was a rumor among the nurses, one that seemed like a whispered secret. The toy boy, according to some patients, just before they miraculously got better, or in some cases before dying, they would find a toy in their beds, usually a teddy bear. The children said that a little boy had given it to them, that he had visited them in their dreams, or worse yet, while they were sleeping. It was a curious story, but I never took it seriously. After all, what was the point of believing in ghost stories? One night, however, something happened that made me question everything I believed. It was a quiet shift, or so it seemed at first. Most of the children were asleep, and only a few remained awake, fighting insomnia with their board games or books. It was after 2 a.m. when I got up from the nurse's station to make a round. There was something disturbing in the air that night, a feeling that I couldn't define. The hospital seemed quieter than usual, as if the entire building was holding its breath. As I checked the rooms, I noticed something strange on Emily's bed, an 8-year-old girl with rheumatic fever. There was a teddy bear that wasn't there before. It was a small one, a dull brown color, with one eye missing and a worn look, as if it had belonged to someone for many years. Emily was sleeping soundly, and I didn't want to wake her. I thought maybe one of the nurses had left it there to comfort her, although I didn't remember seeing it before. I continued my rounds, trying to get the image of the bear out of my head. It was then that I saw him. At the end of the hall, lit by the dim yellow light of the lamps, was a small boy. He was no more than 6 or 7 years old, with dark, messy hair. He was wearing white pajamas that seemed too big for him, and in his hands, he held a teddy bear, identical to the one I had seen on Emily's bed. "What are you doing here?" I asked him, surprised. There was no record of any child that age in the wing that night. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he began to walk slowly down the hall, away from me. "Wait," I said, following him. My voice echoed in the silence, but the boy didn't stop. His steps were light, almost silent, but there was something in his movement that wasn't natural, as if he didn't touch the ground at all. I quickened my step, trying to reach him, but he always seemed to be a few feet away. Finally, he turned a corner that led to an abandoned playroom, a space that had been closed years ago after a fire destroyed part of the wing. When I got to the place, the boy had disappeared. The room was empty, full of dust and furniture covered with white sheets. But in the center of the room, on the floor, there was a little stuffed animal. It was the same as the one I had seen before, with the same missing eye and the same wear and tear. I approached cautiously, feeling my heart beating strongly. As I bent down to pick it up, a soft sound filled the air. It was a childish laugh, light and ethereal, but it came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I turned quickly, looking for the boy, but there was no one. The laughter faded, leaving a silence heavier than before. I went back to the nurse's station with the teddy bear in my hand, unable to shake the feeling that something was following me. I decided not to tell anyone what I had seen. I was afraid they would think I was crazy. But from that night on, things began to change. The children kept mentioning the boy with the toy. A 5-year-old girl told me that she had seen a boy in her room the night before. He told me not to be afraid, she mumbled, playing with a teddy bear that, again, she did not remember having seen before. Another child, a terminally ill leukemia patient, woke up from a deep sleep with a smile on his face. The boy said that I would be okay, he said before closing his eyes. He died that same night, and when I went to check on his bed, I found a teddy bear next to him. I began to avoid walking alone in the halls, especially at night. But one morning, while I was checking the supplies in the storage room, I heard footsteps behind me. They were light like a child's. I turned around quickly, with my heart in my throat, but the hall was empty. Still, I could feel a presence. Something I could not see but knew was there. I finally decided to investigate. I asked the older nurses about the history of the pediatric wing and the toy boy. Most were reluctant to talk, but one, Mrs. Grayson, finally gave in. It was many years ago, before the fire, she said quietly. A little boy died here. He was alone with no family. He was an orphan, and his only solace was a teddy bear that he always carried with him. When he died in the hospital, they didn't know what to do with him. They say they buried him with his teddy. But ever since then, strange things started to happen. I told her what I had seen, hoping she would tell me it was just my imagination. But instead, she nodded grimly. Some people think he's still here, helping children. Others say he's trapped, looking for something, or someone. That never came for him. That night, as I was making my last rounds, I saw the boy again. This time, he didn't run away. He was standing at the end of the hall, looking at me with dark eyes and a calm expression. In his hands, he held the teddy bear. And when he took a step toward me, I felt a chill that penetrated to my bones. I didn't wait for him to come any closer. I ran to the station and never looked back. I submitted my resignation the next day, unable to bear the idea of still working at that place. Now, years later, I still have nightmares about the toy boy. In my dreams, I'm in the dark hallways of the hospital, and I can hear the sound of his footsteps and his soft laugh. I always wake up before he can reach me, but I know that, somehow, he never really let me go. Sometimes, when I'm home alone, I find teddy bears in places I never left them.